Welcome back to The Corner. The world feels a bit crazy right now, and I'm sure that's not unique historically, but we're not in the midst of any wild global conflicts currently, so why does everything feel a bit tense? Why are professors saying math is racist? Why are there queers from Palestine marching in solidarity with a state that punishes homosexuality with death? Well, I might have an answer for you this episode, but it's a doozy, so make sure you're comfortable and let's dive in. In 1848, a couple of cheeky Germans, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, published a little pamphlet called the Communist Manifesto. They were commissioned to do so by the Communist League, an international political party operating out of London. Their ideas were heavily influenced by the socialist thinkers of the 18th and 19th century, but the concept of communal property had been around for thousands of years at the time of its creation. Nevertheless, this little document has become an incredibly influential catechism of sorts for what would come to be known as Marxist thinking. It was on these ideas that Lenin and Stalin built the Soviet Union, Mao built Communist China, and many other tyrants built their regimes such as Pol Pot in Cambodia, Chavez in Venezuela, the Kims in Korea, Castro's in Cuba, Eastern Europe, Bolivia, Zimbabwe, and so on. I've lost count of how often I've heard people say true communism has never been tried. And it's true insofar as no regime has ever transformed into the classless, stateless, utopian end goal that Marxism predicts. By this measure, textbook capitalism has never been tried either, but over and over history has shown us that the more a country adopts communist principles, the worse it gets for its people. Where Marx's ideas are put into practice, it gets worse, a lot worse, and there's no exceptions. I will do a follow-up video to this one explaining why communism doesn't and cannot work in the real world. It is in effect a fairy tale for adults, but that's not the focus of this video. Carrying on, all of this is interesting enough, but done and dusted history, right? After all, the Berlin Wall fell on the 9th of November 1989. 2 years after that, the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or Soviet Union for short, was officially ended on the 26th of December 1991. More and more countries are turning away from communist policies due to their abysmal real-world track record. Capitalism, the economic system responsible for lifting the most people out of poverty, reigns unchallenged, right? Well, not so fast. This is where today's episode really begins.
You see, Marx believed all of history was characterized by the struggle of the proletariat, working class, against the bourgeoisie, ownership class. His theory considers capitalism as one step in the historical progression of economic systems that follow one another in a sequence fueled by class struggle. According to Marx, a revolution of the proletariat was inevitable, and society would then progress to its next natural economic stage, socialism, and then onto the final stage, communism. Again, this wasn't a concept unique to Marx. Many, if not most, intellectuals of his time shared this sentiment, and it was held by socialists of all stripes. Later, in a letter to Benito Mussolini dated 22nd April 1944, Adolf Hitler expressed a very similar consideration but favored fascism over communism as the final stage. Capitalism, too, had run its course. The nations were no longer willing to stand for it. The victors to survive would be fascism and National Socialism, maybe Bolshevism in the East. However, back when the First World War rolled around, and rather than rising up in rebellion, many workers enlisted. The theorists were initially puzzled. What they came to was a conclusion the problem lay not in economics but culture. One thinker in particular, Antonio Gramsci, co-founder of the Communist Party of Italy, started to question whether it was Western values themselves that was the real barrier to revolution. If people clung to family, tradition, and religion, then regardless of how severe the economic climate was, revolution would never be considered. To change that, to make possible ideological transformation, nothing less than the very culture would need to be replaced. While serving a prison sentence for his criticism of Mussolini, the dissident Gramsci put to pen his theories about how, in capitalist societies, the ruling bourgeoisie class uses cultural institutions to maintain power. This is the work he is best known for, the theory of cultural hegemony, and something we'll come back to. In 1923, at the Goethe University of Frankfurt, influenced by Gramsci and other Marxist intellectuals of the time, like Yoda Lukács, a new school was formed under the patronage of wealthy ideologue Felix Wheel. Its name was the Institution for Social Research, but has become much better known as the Frankfurt School. Their goal was the development of Marxist theory in Germany and exploring it beyond politics. The unique approach of the school was only further solidified when, due to illness, the founding director Karl Grunberg was replaced by Max Horkheimer. This new director was not an economist nor a historian, but rather trained in psychology and philosophy. This led to the school moving away from its focus on economics and towards the social sciences. That is, moving from a study of the economy to a study of people, society, and culture, a more holistic approach combining Marxist class struggle with Freud's theories of subconscious. Horkheimer was also a bit more skeptical of Marx's historical stage theory, though at the time of his taking the reins, it was still very popular amongst German intellectuals. Indeed, in 1917's Russia, exactly Marx's prediction had happened: an abolishing of the monarch, an establishment of Soviet rule in its place eventually under Lenin's Bolsheviks. Days before the end of World War I, there had been a revolt in Germany also, but in that instance the more moderate National Socialist Workers' Party had gotten the better of the communist faction. The Nazi Party would not remain very moderate for long, however, as Hitler came to power just over a decade later in 1933, and it ended up being quite bad news for the faculty of the Frankfurt School, as the majority of them were ethnically Jewish. It was under these conditions that the Frankfurt School made the decision to flee Germany and move to one of the bastions of American intellectual life, Columbia University in New York. There's an irony to the fact that it was a capitalist nation that offered these refugees safe haven and even a new platform as they sought and would continue to seek its undermining. You see, if you put economics aside, the control and political framework of a fascist society has much more in common with communism than it does with liberalism of a capitalist nation like the United States. As observed by Nobel Prize-winning economist Friedrich Hayek in The Road to Serfdom, the communists and Nazis clashed more frequently with each other than with other parties simply because they competed for the same kind of mind, and reserved for each other the hatred of the heretic. Their practice showed how closely they are related to both. The real enemy, the man with whom they had nothing in common, was the liberal of the old type. Anyway, this wraps up our historical jaunt, as we now find the Frankfurt School, a group of Freud and Marx-inspired psychoanalytical neo-communists, were embedded in an influential American university, and this is where we find the meat of today's episode.
At this point, the Frankfurt School was concerned less with what Marx called the economic base and more with the political and societal superstructure of society. There were a number of significantly impactful thinkers that affected the rationale, teaching, and publications of the school. One of these individuals was Theodor Adorno, who had been collaborating with the school since their move to New York, but was formally appointed as a member of the institute when joining them in exile in 1938. Adorno very much embraced Gramsci's ideas about cultural hegemony, the idea that the bourgeois used cultural institutions to maintain their power. He embraced and elevated this concept, feeling that all traditional philosophy is a cover for social oppression. In his book Negative Dialectics, Adorno writes, "The totality of identical definitions would correspond to the wish-fulfillment picture of traditional philosophy, to its a priori structure and to its archaistic late-form ontology, yet before any specific content the structure is spiritualized coercion. Put far more simply, definitions, whatever reality they are trying to impart, are secretly coercive." His ire wasn't reserved for philosophy either. Traditional art was also on the chopping block. Adorno's aesthetic theory holds that traditional art and its presentation of what is considered beautiful perpetuates oppression. As he famously wrote, to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, because poetry or any other positive art transmits a kind of aesthetic truth value, and so oppresses that which falls outside of the portrayed value. Another very influential member of the faculty was the Lukács-inspired Herbert Marcuse. Like his colleague Adorno, he appealed to the rejection of distinct forms in traditional philosophy. His focus, however, was on the rejection of gender and the sexual differences between them because that is the most fundamental distinction into which traditional society splits people. His view was that sexuality had been repressed by economic systems and labour relations which were oppressive by nature. The bourgeois capitalists forced people to work so as to extract surplus value from their labour. Therefore, people cannot be allowed to play freely, which would involve the pursuit of sexuality for pleasure's sake. By extension, heterosexual marital reproduction has been the standard due to oppression, but if capitalism is abolished and communism takes hold, there will be no need for repressing sexuality any longer. In his book Eros and Civilization, Marcuse writes, "Reactivation of polymorphic and narcissistic sexuality ceases to be a threat to culture and can itself be culture-building if the organism exists not as an instrument of alienated labour, but as a subject of self-realisation. In other words, if societally useful work at the same time is the transparent satisfaction of individual need." And no, it's not lost on me that the sex-obsessed member of the faculty has a name that sounds like some wretched hoe referencing her fish market. Moving on, it was a collaboration of these minds and others building on the work of previous thinkers like Marx, Hegel and Kant that led director Horkheimer to coin the term for the school's most famous invention, critical theory. This creation centers on the analysis and confrontation of systemic power relations in society. It uses the standard language of dominant and oppressed groups in lieu of bourgeoisie and proletariat and explores the power dynamics of these categories. Explicitly designed with the socio-political goal of transforming society, the impact of this theory cannot be overstated. It wasn't just factory owners versus workers anymore. The Marxist class struggle had suddenly been expanded to include women versus the patriarchy, minority races versus supposedly dominant ethnicities, queers versus the heteronormative status quo, and so on.
More than a mere academic critique, what was birthed was an unrelenting attack on the foundations of Western civilization: law, art, faith, family, and tradition. Every aspect was framed as a mechanism of oppression. Those that upheld tradition were complicit in this oppression. If you defied it, you were enlightened. Here the language of identity politics started to form. No doubt you've heard the term woke. Whatever it means to people now, it originally signified being awake to the oppression of tradition and culturally dominant groups. Something that hadn't changed is that it was still very much the language and mentality of people looking to stoke a revolution. The problem is that if it isn't a sudden popular surge, if it wasn't confined to the common people versus the ruling class, then there isn't a lot of difference between a revolution and a civil war. Hence the title of this episode, The Quiet War. We're in the midst of a deliberate ideological conflict and have been for decades. Calculated and tactical in their desire to transform society, one of the core principles advocated by the Frankfurt School was another idea originally conceived by Antonio Gramsci. He emphasized that ruling classes maintain power not just through coercion, force, laws, police, but through cultural and ideological consent. He argued that the dominant group secures legitimacy by shaping ideas, norms, and common sense, and therefore opposition must work on both political and intellectual fronts, not just through revolutionary acts. Gramsci had called it the war of position. It was later labelled the Long March through the institutions. This concept emphasized the need to infiltrate key social institutions in order to transform cultural values from within. Opposing hegemony, in his view, requires patient cultural and intellectual work, not just immediate political or military action. Targeted especially for infiltration were universities, media, and religious institutions. Marcuse, in particular, ran with this idea as the school moved away from hoping for a working-class revolution. In later years, he even found himself moving to Washington and working for the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner to the CIA. It was also Marcuse, in his 1965 essay Repressive Tolerance, advocated showing tolerance for radical movements on the left while being intolerant of right-wing viewpoints with the goal of shifting society towards a more socialist structure. Here he argued that even neutral tolerance inherently favors oppressive dominant ideologies and therefore should be avoided. This was labeled liberating tolerance. The idea that it should only be extended to progressive ideas because opposing ideas are dangerous and so should be silenced has set the stage for today's cancel culture. Because politics is downstream from culture, the influence of this quiet war, this subversive Marxist revolution, also leaked into politics and became very entrenched there. Such influence was, after all, one of the Frankfurt School's founding objectives. In the 1950s, while at the University of California, Berkeley, our old buddy Theodor Adorno and colleagues set about studying authoritarianism. He published his results in a book called The Authoritarian Personality. Most famously, this derived an F-scale, which, by asking a set of questions, reportedly revealed how likely an individual was to support fascism. The test placed them on a spectrum from democratic to authoritarian. What is interesting is what research at Berkeley was heavily influenced by earlier research conducted at the Frankfurt School prior to leaving Germany. The difference was that the earlier scale had been from revolutionary to authoritarian. That is to say, revolutionary to authoritarian fascist had been replaced with democratic, i.e. Democrat, to fascist. It's no mere coincidence that right-wing political figures such as Reagan, Bush, and most recently Trump are regularly tarred with the F-slur, and I don't mean a bundle of sticks. Or do I? The word fascism, like the F-slur aimed at the queer community, are both derived from the same Latin word for a bundle of sticks. The fascists choose the word because of the connotation that many working together for one goal form something stronger. The more you know. Back to our episode. Given that fascism was originally the primary opponent of the communist promoting school, it's not surprising that today you'll find that those that position themselves in opposition to its goals are labelled fascists. If you're still not convinced that we're living in a world saturated by the influence of the Frankfurt School, perhaps you'd realise it if I mentioned some of the derivative fields of study that emerged out of critical theory. Derek Bell is often called the father of critical race theory, which he developed in the late 1970s directly from the framework laid out by Horkheimer's school. This concept teaches that the most important thing about you is your race. Racism is present everywhere and always, that if you're a member of a minoritized racial group, then you're a victim of a system designed to work against you. By contrast, if your race is privileged, then just like the bourgeois, you're an exploiter, whether intentional or not.
As a side note, chalk demons like me, that is, crackers with a hard R, are not considered a minoritized race, despite making up just 8% of the global ethnicity demographics.
Bell argued that racism is permanent in American society, and then building upon Bell's idea came Kimberlé Crenshaw, a scholar of CRT best known for developing the concept of intersectionality, which examines how race, gender, and other identities overlap in systems of oppression. Roughly a decade before Bell, a man named Stokely Carmichael, along with Charles Hamilton, is credited with developing the concept of institutional racism. Carmichael was a Black Power activist who helped found the National Black Panther Party, but would later go on to criticize them for not being separatist enough. Though not a classical Marxist, Stokely combined Marxism with Pan-Africanist and Black nationalist perspectives. It was also around this era that Patricia Biddle-Padver coined the idea that racism is prejudice plus power. All of these developments came on the heels of critical theory being published, and all with a Marxist view of oppressor versus oppressed, only framed in racial terms. You don't need to look back that far to remember Black Lives Matter riots in the US and protests around the world following George Floyd's death. They even had protests in countries like Sri Lanka, where colonizers make up less than 0.25% of the population. That iconic fist image paraded at those events is the same one used by Black Power, which is iconography also used to denote communism, in particular communist revolution. Feminism is another area where critical theory was incredibly impactful. I'm not talking about first-wave feminism here, legal equality especially with regards to voting. No, that movement ended a century ago and lent heavily upon the Christian concept of Imago Dei, that all humans are made in God's image, and thus of equal worth. No, I'm talking about the waves that have come since then, specifically critical gender theory, an academic framework that aims to deconstruct traditional societal norms, that is, challenging traditional gender roles. This included access to reproductive rights, which in New Zealand and Australia has become abortion on demand, right up until the point of birth. It didn't stop there either, fighting the patriarchy and toxic masculinity, challenging rigid definitions of womanhood, trans inclusion, body and sex positivity. According to Simone de Beauvoir, the hero of second-wave feminism, probably the premier feminist academic of the 20th century, no woman should be authorized to stay at home and raise her children. Society should be totally different. Women should not have that choice, precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will make that one. These fields of study, second-wave feminism onwards, the free love movement, and sexual revolution all found inspiration and influence from the Frankfurt School, critical theory, and of course, more specifically Herbert Marcuse and Wilhelm Reich. This man Reich was yet another Jewish European academic who crossed the Atlantic in 1939 and collaborated with the school, and his impact on these topics was immense. He was a Freudo-Marxist, that is, he worked directly with Sigmund Freud and had literally authored a book called The Sexual Revolution in 1936, himself being considered father to the movement of the same name. Like Marcuse, he believed that sexual repression imposed by the traditional family, school, and church led to the creation of individuals who crave submission and fear freedom. This, of course, completely kneecaps their ability to be revolutionaries. What he believed was that once a person is liberated sexually, they're not going to commit crimes anymore, because they're satisfied. They have everything they want, and the state will give them everything they need. Reich stated that the repression of sexuality, particularly among the youth, paralyzes the rebellious forces because it causes anxiety and inhibits critical thinking. In fact, this guy talked about the young ones quite a lot. He discussed the need for free sexual rights of children, felt that babies needed to have orgasms, children need to have sex with each other, adults even need to watch children have sex with each other. Despite this, he was lauded by critical theorists and publications like the New York Times, a veritable hero amongst Hollywood.
This brings us quite naturally to my next point. Why is this so bad? What's my issue with people thinking differently to me, feeling some cozy commie vibes and LARPing as revolutionaries? Marcuse and Reich's influence is plain to see in today's sex-obsessed culture, but it is from their work that we now get to a place where we have people advocating for MAPS. If you're fortunate enough not to be familiar with that acronym, I'm sorry to inform you, it stands for Minor Attracted Person, a friend of the playground, a PDF file, an Epstein loyalty card holder. It is also on their shoulders that we've built a society where people are fighting for the right of a biological man to use the same bathroom as little girls, where a subpar male athlete can throw hands with a woman, break her orbital socket, and it's celebrated. The destruction of the traditional family unit hasn't just been approached by appealing to a sexual revolution either. Politicians, the progressives among them having long ago become heavily onboarded with this Marxist revolution, have done their part also. Just like in the US and no doubt many other countries, being a single parent is now often more financially appealing than trying to struggle through as a family. Besides creating a permanent independent voter bloc from beneficiaries, it has doubled as a way of uprooting one of the institutions openly targeted by the Frankfurt School, the family unit. Critical race theory is also destructive. It is not a continuation of the civil rights movement, it undermines it completely. In light of such a framework, Martin Luther King was a damn fool, naive at best. White folk can only ever, whether consciously or not, judge other ethnicities based on the colour of their skin, never by the content of their character. There are impacts that are even more calamitous than this. Remember Adorno's concepts regarding traditional thinking and art being instruments of oppression? Well, this means that anything that presents itself as whole, healthy, harmonious, beautiful, true is actually threatening and in a sense evil. This means that any beautiful art, any wholesome moral or virtuous theme in a movie or novel must be a mechanism of oppression and therefore engaged with negatively. But it goes deeper, eating into the very roots of everything our civilization has been built upon. Critical theory was initially introduced into the soft sciences at universities, the humanities like history and psychology, but since then in the last decade or so it has moved more and more into all fields, including the hard sciences like math and engineering. Reason itself is under attack. Though it might sound related, critical theory is not critical thinking. In fact, it seeks to destroy critical thinking since that is a part of our tradition. Let me back that up. Here are a couple of quotes directly from scholars aligned with critical theory.
The critical thinking tradition is concerned primarily with epistemic adequacy. To be critical is to show good judgment in recognizing when arguments are faulty, assertions lack evidence, truth claims appeal to unreliable sources, or concepts are sloppily crafted and applied. For critical thinkers, the problem is that people fail to examine the assumptions, commitments, and logic of daily living. The basic problem is irrational, illogical, and unexamined living. Critical thinking and critical pedagogy, relations, differences, and limits. Nicholas Goebbels and Rupert Burke.
Sounds pretty good, right? I'm on board with unexamined living being not ideal. Now contrast that with the following.
Critical pedagogy, that is, critical theory approach to education, begins from a different set of assumptions, rooted in neo-Marxian literature on critical theory commonly associated with the Frankfurt School. Here, the critical learner is someone who is empowered and motivated to seek justice and emancipation. Critical pedagogy regards the claims that students make and respond to social justice issues not as propositions to be assessed for their truth value, but as expressions of power that function to reinscribe and perpetuate social inequalities. Its mission is to teach students ways of identifying and mapping how power shapes our understanding of the world. This is the first step towards resisting and transforming social injustices. By interrogating the politics of knowledge production, this tradition also calls into question the uses of the accepted critical thinking toolkit to determine epistemic adequacy. To extend Audre Lorde's classic metaphor, the tools of the critical thinking tradition, for example, validity, soundness, conceptual clarity, cannot dismantle the master's house. They can temporarily beat the master at his own game, but they can never bring about any enduring structural change. They fail because the critical thinker's toolkit is commonly invoked in particular settings at particular times to reassert power. Those adept with the tools often use them to restore an order that assures their comfort. They can be habitually invoked to defend our epistemic home terrain. Tracking privilege, preserving epistemic pushback in feminist and race philosophy classes, 2017 by Alison Bailey.
You combine this way of thinking with other principles such as those found in critical race theory, and that's how you get the current trend of university professors condemning math as racist. Being on time is also racist, so is valuing objectivity, hard work, standardizations within communication conventions. It's all bad, all systemic oppression. This contrasts sharply with the sentiment expressed by George Orwell in his famous book 1984. Freedom is the freedom to say 2 + 2 = 4. The need to replace established hegemony includes that which seeded the Enlightenment, religion, or more specifically, Christianity. I'm not sure if you noticed earlier, but Adorno described the traditional as spiritualized coercion. At its heart, Marxism was always sought to be a new religion, a substitute for the spiritual tradition. In the Communist Confession of Faith, an earlier Engels written outline of communist principles that directly paved the way for the Communist Manifesto, the following is written. All religions which have existed hitherto are expressions of historical stages of development, of individual peoples or groups of peoples, but communism is that stage of historical development which makes all existing religions superfluous and supersedes them. Marx openly referred to his ideology in the manifesto itself as the New Gospel, and one of his most famous and regularly quoted lines is from his 1844 work, A Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of the Right, that religion is the opium of the people. It comforts people in distress but also dulls the mind, preventing the confronting and challenging of the system which was his ultimate goal. One of Marx's adherents that we've mentioned repeatedly, Antonio Gramsci, argued that socialism is precisely the religion that must overthrow or replace Christianity. The Soviet Union, China, Albania, North Korea and others have all destroyed churches, mosques and synagogues, arrested or executed clergy and banned religious practice. You see, the state must be your ultimate authority in all things, including your faith. The impact of this movement has been colossal, and once you start to notice, you'll see it everywhere. While Marxism might still march in the streets waving red banners with revolution fists painted on them or anti-fascist sloganeering, it's just as likely to proselytize you through viral videos, HR meetings, hashtags, and corporate virtue signaling. Its influence saturates Hollywood, which is why you'll see the president of Lucasfilms wearing a The Force is Female shirt, alienating 70% of her audience, or a movie like The American Society of Magical Negroes, where the protagonist must be wary of the white tears gauge of Caucasian characters. It is at war with free speech, tradition, the family, logic, and God, and now, as it is becoming, or probably already has become, the dominant philosophy, that war footing does not appear to be softening, if anything, quite the opposite. To quote Marx from the Communist Manifesto, the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production. Forcible seizing of property has always been at the core of communism because it has always been a jealous thing full of bitterness from its conception. It is an idea fueled on the basis of resentment that someone else has more than you. According to Bertrand Russell, Marx pretended he wanted the happiness of the proletariat. What he really wanted was the unhappiness of the bourgeois. It is not a new or even recent desire. The very first sin recorded in the Bible, which doesn't stem from Satan's tempting but rather man's fallen nature, is Cain killing Abel in a fit of jealousy. In Exodus 20, the famous passage of the Ten Commandments, we're warned against coveting in our neighbour's possessions for good reason. Remember again that critical theory doesn't allow for impartiality or neutrality, it forces one to take a position. As Marx wrote himself, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, the point is to change it. When academics buy into critical theory, they inevitably end up as activists and advocates, unable to grade fairly the work of any student who might question their teachings, because such a student isn't just wrong, they're the enemy. In this way, much of academia has fallen into a self-reinforcing spiral. This self-identification as revolutionaries in a war against the oppressors means that Marxist activists will pick up allies wherever possible. In his essay, Ecology and the Critique of Modern Society, Marcuse states environmentalism can be both a political and psychological movement of liberation. Now, I think looking after the environment is a good idea, if not simple common sense. But climate alarmism, making environmentalism that necessitates the upheaval and reshaping society a key aspect of your identity, that is something that you'll commonly see included by groups, individuals and political parties that embrace the Marxist ideology. If you've been paying attention to climate activism in recent years, you've probably also seen the Adorno-inspired practice of attacking traditional artwork. Under the same principle of seeking allies, you'll see the progressive left linking arms and marching with some very non-progressive comrades. The alliance against a greater mutual enemy is why Islam is so readily accepted and supported by the Marxists. Quest for Palestine shouldn't make sense, but within this wartime framework of thinking, it does. This is why multiple polls have recently shown that over 50% of younger people support Hamas over Israel, despite the former having publicly kidnapped, tortured, sexually assaulted and executed people on 7th of October 2023. Communism wants to overthrow the established governance of the West, so does Islam. Communism wants to abolish the established religions of the West, so does Islam. Both are willing to use physical force to obtain their goals, and ironically, just like the fascism that progressives claim to hate, both communism and Islamic Sharia law require totalitarianism. Perhaps the blue-haired, septum-ring sporting Antifa and the Intifada role-playing as 7th century caravan traders aren't as different as they first appear. Not only all this, but also the acolytes of Marxism are well funded, not only by the helping hand of aligned politicians, but also organisations with political ambitions. For those unaware, the World Economic Forum is an international advocacy group and think tank funded by over 1,000 member companies, each with typically over $5 billion turnover. Just like Marx himself, the WEF advocates for globalization and holds an annual conference in Davos, Switzerland, attended by all sorts, including investors like George Soros, multiple Hollywood stars, and world leaders such as New Zealand's own Jacinda Ardern. Klaus Schwab is the founder of this organization, and within it runs the Forum of Young Global Leaders, an incredibly exclusive apprenticeship of sorts. In a 2017 interview, Schwab boldly admitted that the World Economic Forum, through the Young Global Leaders program, penetrates governments across the world. To give you some idea of the reach this organisation has, here are some of their better-known disciples. Justin Trudeau, Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, Vladimir Putin, Jacinda Ardern, Roger Federer, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Leonardo DiCaprio, Wycliffe Jean, Ashton Kutcher, Chris Tucker, and of course here in Australia, Sarah Hanson-Young. Their ranks include individuals that are or have been world leaders of Austria, Belgium, Canada, Costa Rica, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Mexico, Montenegro, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Russia, Sweden, the United Nations, and United Kingdom. Not to mention the co-founders of Yahoo, Google, YouTube, and PayPal. Among other things, it is as hard to understate the influence of the World Economic Forum as it is the impact of the Frankfurt School itself. One of the most infamous statements regarding the forum and its true ambitions coming to global attention was the phrase, "You'll own nothing and you'll be happy." This was based on a 2016 essay by Danish politician Ida Auken called Welcome to 2030. WEF published an article and a video including this phrase in 2018, not long before COVID hit the world, and in response prompted the forum to launch a program they called the Great Reset. Hollywood and the entertainment industry can purchase popular intellectual properties and turn them one after another into money-bleeding, identity politics-laden sermons on the message, due to the financial incentives of Klaus Schwab's WEF or his contemporaries like George Soros and his Open Societies Foundation. There's a reason the ever-present progressive protesting mob turns up with professionally made signs, are often bused to location, and in some instances even admit to being paid for their displays of social unrest. If I've somehow failed to do so, the closing lines of the Communist Manifesto make their goals clear as day. The Communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forceful overthrow of all existing social conditions. Yet the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletariat have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. So where to from here? The legacy of the Frankfurt School is woven deep into the fabric of our society, steadily working to erode genuine liberalism which promotes freedom and the conservative values upon which our civilization has been built. What's more, they want to exchange these things for a framework that history has proven time and again leads to magnifications in human suffering. Well, in the words of Sir Francis Bacon, knowledge itself is power, a rephrasing of a much older proclamation in the Book of Proverbs that a wise man is full of strength and a man of knowledge enhances his might. I remember when I attended university over 20 years ago, I was fed the same Marxist messaging, and even then I noticed I was graded more harshly if I dared to question it. What I didn't notice back then is that I was being fed revolution-grade rhetorical ordnance. I wish I had someone offering a countering opinion so that I could have measured the matter more fairly and come to a reasonable conclusion sooner. We can be that small voice of reason. Perhaps like me, you know people who wish to pursue doing good, seeking justice and the prospering of humankind. If that's genuinely their impetus, then perhaps they need to hear about the track record of the Marxist thinking they embrace. Perhaps a discussion about the ultimate repercussions of rejecting the good aspects of tradition, a gentle reminder not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, or to consider how identity politics will ultimately result in the antithesis of what it claims to champion. I know many who frankly like the idea of appearing open-minded freethinkers who are simply a little more thoughtful and introspective than those that go along with tradition. Maybe all they need is to realise they're not riding the cutting edge of some new idea. Instead, their entire lives, a quiet academic movement almost 2 centuries old has been shepherding society's thinking in the very direction they've adopted. Finally, what of you, my brothers and sisters in Christ? Well, as Ephesians' famous passage on the armour of God points out, we've always been at war, only it's not against individuals or even physical forces. It's against the rulers, powers, and authorities of this present darkness, against spiritual forces of evil. Regarding earthly individuals, Matthew 5 entreats us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. The substitute pseudo-religion of Marxism has burrowed its way into the church as much as anywhere else, and its message of endless grievance politics is anathema to the gospel of repentance and reconciliation. Once again, the sharing of knowledge is crucial, for as Paul bids in 2 Corinthians 10 verse 5, We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. So go and restore your siblings with gentleness and love. With that, we finally come to a close. I know it was a big one, so hats off to anyone who made it this far. We greatly appreciate your support and look forward to your engagement in the comments section. But that's all for now, so until next time, have a good one.